Hey everyone, I just finished reading this book, The World After Gaza. Um, 10 out of 10 straight away, absolutely brilliant. Best book I've read on Gaza or Palestine. I've reviewed the 100 Years War on Palestine, and I think that one's by Noam Chomsky. No, that one's by somebody else, but I've reviewed a couple on this channel. This is the best one I've read so far for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's not written by an Arab. Um, and that's only good not because there's anything wrong with Arabs. Um, they're probably best placed to speak about what's happening in Palestine. It's written by an Indian, Pankaj Mishra, and that introduces another perspective. One of the things I learned from this book, well, I relearned from this book, I'd already heard it, but not seen it in the context of a book, so I wasn't sure whether to trust it because books have to be well researched and generally edited. Well, some of them do. There's a lot of BS out there. That for many decades, one of the best-selling books in India has been Mein Kampf by Hitler. It's admired as a piece of work on nation building. Apparently, the Hindu nationalists there feel that India has been taken away from them specifically, and in order to reclaim it, even though they didn't really take part in the fight against colonialism, the Brits, that's part of their narrative now about we got rid of the Brits. We were ruled over by Muslims for 750 years, then we were ruled over by Brits for 250 years and brutalized, and now we have to take the country back. And so part of that is ethnic cleansing, part of that is the idea that they are a master race, the Hindus are a master race. And so really it's not surprising learning that there's a big appetite for books like Mein Kampf in India. And of course, now Modi's India is very closely aligned with, is a big supporter of Zionism, of Israel. If you look at social media, they go off the charts in their cheerleading for genocide whenever Israel's conducting a war, whether it's this one or the one in 2020 and 2016, or they go back decades, obviously. So that surprised me. Also, the writer talks about, I'm not sure if it's a man or a woman, how bad, I'd have to look them up, talks about their own conversion from someone who was a great admirer of Zionism because they saw these Jewish people building their own nation where they'd previously been, persecuted, and a lot of Indians felt like that. So for a lot of Indian Zionists were heroes until, I'm going to assume until he visited Palestine and saw what was going on. What was being done was that there was this creation of this muscular Jew, as it was called. So Ben Gurion, one of the, I think the first Prime Minister of Israel, he looked upon survivors of the Holocaust as less than human, wimps, disgusting people who deserved to die. So it was not, it was, this wasn't a very nice guy. I think maybe a lot of it was displacement. He thought that the new Jew, the muscular Jew, the Zionist, should be tall, blonde, muscular with, blue eyes. And if you look at Ben Gurion, he was short with frizzy hair and just looked strange. So probably everything he hated about what he perceived as Jewishness, which would have been internalized through living in Europe. In Poland, there are many instances here, instances cited in this book, where Christian villagers gleefully took part in the murder of thousands of Jews living amongst them, burned their properties, stole their stuff, and when some of them survived, they're said to have noted, we didn't kill them, or did we? There you go. So so if that's the case, and if it's generally always been Christians murdering Jews, and Europeans murdering Jews, where does the whole idea of the Christian Judeo alliance come from? That was for the Second World War. That was for the Cold War, because communism is famously anti-religious, and so the West very quickly forgave Nazis. In the 1950s, Nazis were just, okay, you're all fine now, we need you to help fight the Russians. Nazism carried on. The Jews that had been liberated, and they were stuck there. They were basically stuck in prison camps ruled over by Americans or Germans or whoever else. It was only really the Russians, despite their own pogroms of Jews, it was the Russian army that liberated all the places like Auschwitz and Dachau. This whole myth that's been created of the Americans going around and freeing Jews and liberating them, It's the same kind of BS you see now about America liberating countries. Actually, they're going there to kill everyone and steal the oil. I think I quoted in the previous book, or one of the previous books I reviewed, the joke about the USA is very, very lucky. Wherever it takes freedom, it finds oil. Same kind of thing. So that made this book particularly good. It looked at it from a different perspective. Um, you know, and then one of the things in there is also about, I didn't know how much racism there was towards Middle Eastern Jews by the European Jews who went and pretty much commandeered Zionism. There's also a parallel drawn in this book, which is very interesting, about how Africans who were, just disposable, as were Asians, disposable fodder for murdering to Europeans. When the Second World War came about, they were just sent onto the battlefield. In the same way, when Israel waged wars, when he went to the Middle East and you had Jews already living there, obviously they'd coexisted with Muslims and Christians for centuries, they hated them because they weren't white, essentially. So they're the ones who got sent into wars and everything. They were the disposable ones. They were the ones who were cheap labor. When there were Yemeni Jews, who had very, very few Jews actually emigrated into Palestine because they weren't, they weren't really kicked out. They just didn't go there because there weren't that many economic opportunities. They all went to America or wherever else. America and Europe, like I said, and it's very clearly detailed in this book, did everything they could to prevent taking Jews after the Second World War. So the idea of the West being the liberators, those who aren't anti-Semitic is absolutely ridiculous. Anti-Semitism was pretty much taken to the Middle East by Europeans, and for centuries, the treatment of Jews was disgusting in Europe. During the First World War, in fact, Britain helped the Nazis for a long time. They knew what they were doing to Jews. George Orwell wrote that when treatment of Jews, or the mass murder of Jews under the Nazis started reaching America and the UK, people were either, well, that can't be true, no, they won't do that, or so what? He said these bits of knowledge bounced off the consciousness like peas off of a steel helmet. Yeah. Britain got involved in the Second World War because they had a treaty with Poland, and when Poland was invaded, they invoked the treaty, so Britain had to go to war. Otherwise, they were happy just to let, the idea was that Hitler would take over all of Europe. That would be another white superpower. Britain already had lots of colonies, so that was another white superpower, and then the whole world would be ruled by white supremacists. Thank God for Poland. Thank God for the Warsaw Ghetto standing up, so that Britain actually had to get involved and fight Hitler rather than just kind of help him along as they had been doing, and as America had been doing. All right. Another thing I learned in this book, when the League of Nations was signed after the Second World War, was it after the Second World War or the First World War? I think it might have been the First World War. Japan was in there, and they said that part of what we're drawing up should be ethnic equality, because they fought with the Allies. To which Balfour of the Balfour Treaty, the guy who gave away Palestine, said, "No way! I cannot believe that any European is not greater than, or no African is equal to a European. I just can't believe it." So there was none of that, none of that equality there. Another idea raised in this book, which I thought was fascinating, was the nonsense idea that Western civilization was peaceful. And there's a phrase in there I hadn't heard before: from Plato to NATO. Western civilization, not just in this book, as you read more, and as people can now see, because of social media, because of what people see about Palestine, because of what people see about so many other countries, has generally advanced through genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the disposability of anyone who's not white. That is evident right now, because look at the difference in the treatment of Palestine compared to Ukraine. When the Ukraine war started, there were actually news anchors who went and said, I mean, these aren't Muslims, these aren't brown people, these are our own, we have to do something. Right? Palestinians, let them die. Yeah. The Shoah, the Holocaust, was not really a thing until the 60s. In the 60s, when Israel was basically conducting, the Yom Kippur War, or was that in the 70s, wars, they looked for a reason to justify themselves. So that is when the idea of the Holocaust, the idea of the Shoah, became essentially, mass promoted. That we suffered the greatest suffering ever, and because of that, we can pretty much get away with anything. That's where it came from. Before never again, it was actually never again for any person in any country. But even in Eastern Europe, after it had all been done, it wasn't really much talked about because it wasn't the only Holocaust. In Russia, you had the the Holodomor, where tens of millions of people died under Stalinism, and it wasn't just because of that was brutality. That was a mass cleansing. Cleansing is a horrible word. That was a mass murder, a mass killing. And now, as more and more people start to speak about their suffering, and people are actually aware of the suffering of the Palestinians, the whole weaponization by Israel and its Western supporters of the Holocaust as the greatest suffering ever, which must never be repeated, and if you say a single thing we don't like, then you're an anti-Semite, blah, 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 all that nonsense. It's starting to fall apart. It's not effective anymore. The book doesn't end on a high note of optimism. I'm so tempted to just read you a bit because it's so good. It doesn't end on a high note of optimism. I'm going to read you a bit. It says that hopefully the brave people who are actually protesting, and how do the elites, how do the whites respond? Not just the whites, because of course you've got the Turkish Islamists, you've got the Indian Hindu nationalists, but it is generally the whites, white supremacy. So at the turn of the century, there was a best-selling book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. Seriously, it was called that. All right. So let me read you this. Popular books such as The War on the West, I think that's by that moron Douglas Murray, Islamophobe and Zionist. Popular books such as The War on the West, present-day counterparts of the early 20th century bestseller The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, urge greater unity among white Westerners. Basically, we have to stand up, we have to fight an enemy. So another thing about massive racists, whereas the most persecuted people used to be Jews, as per religion, but really overall Africans and brown people, anyone who wasn't white. Now, if you're going to have a religious equivalent, it's Muslims. Why do so many far-right people, EDL, Tommy Robinson, EDL was actually founded by an IDF soldier. It was originally part of the JDO, Jewish Defense League, a far-right extremist racist group, ethnocentrists. As a female Israeli soldier, I can't remember her name now, but if you look on Company's House, she's the one who originally listed it as a business. Why do these far-right groups, like Viktor Orban, who's virulently anti-Semitic, why does Netanyahu and all the Israeli extremists running that country hug up to him so much? Because they help them identify the terrorist Muslims. So for the for the Jews, it's not for the Jews, beg your pardon, for the Zionists, it's an excuse to just massacre and murder and steal and kill and establish ethno-supremacy, European white ethno-supremacy, and for all the other racists, it's an excuse to blame someone else for all the evils of the world instead of Jews and hide their own anti-Semitism. Really fantastic book, people. There's so much more I could say about it. There was, in this whole, you've got Ben Gurion, who really hated Jews and thought they're weak and pathetic and wanted them to all be like Nazis, basically, the Nazi area. And he went around for ages calling anyone who opposed him the new Hitler. So, Netanyahu's bullshit is nothing new. It's been an original Israeli policy. There was a guy, Vanekanada, I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong, who was a Hindu nationalist who hated the idea that he'd internalized from, probably from Europeans, that all Hindus were weak and pathetic. And he urged Hindus to eat beef and build muscle. Eat beef for a Hindu. Come on. So, and then there was one megalomaniac of a ruler in Arabia who, because he wanted to build his own nations, he saw, all of the white superpowers, France, England, Germany, were doing this ethnic cleansing and nation building. The reason it became a problem when the Nazis did it, like I said, was because Poland dared to fight back. and so a treaty was invoked, and Winston Churchill, who was himself famously anti-Semitic and racist, had to get involved. Of course, he said to Poland, "I'll do it if you give us all your coal." There was a deal. There was a deal to be made there. But good. They repelled the Nazis, but the Nazis were only doing the same thing as they did. It was the problem there was that a lot of the victims were white. There's an Austrian writer who said, what we've been doing to this is in this was before the First World War, so in 1914, white supremacist nationalism, empire building is coming to haunt Europe. Cue the fascism and the Second World War. Excellent book. So I'll go back to the close of the book, where Mishra says that these people who are protesting now, against Gaza, against ethnic cleansing, against racism and empire building and everything, the growing perception that the mass murder of Jews wasn't the only suffering ever, the Jewish Holocaust. Even in Germany is the only country in the world, and Germany is massively, a lapdog for Israel. When Israel was being set up, there was a trial in Israel of a guy called Eichmann, who was basically, I think, an SS guy involved in murdering thousands of people, millions of people, millions of Jews. He was actually just a small cog in a much bigger machine. So the Germans said to Israel, just take care of this so none of us get implicated. And Israel said, all right, if you give us weapons and billions of pounds, or Deutschmarks, done. There was no morality in it. It was nation building an ethno-state. Like I said, Ben-Gurion didn't really have much regard. He had contempt for the Jews who were killed. Probably because he could have been one of them and it was fair, right? Often fair turns into violence. And it talks about a lot of literature as well. The book talks about a lot of literature, like the racist novel Exodus, which Ben-Gurion said, "Oh, what a fantastic crap piece of writing, but what a fantastic piece of propaganda." We came here to bring peace. No, you came here to kill everyone, including other Jews that you didn't like because they weren't as white as you. And now it's barefaced for all to see, really, isn't it? It's barefaced for all to see. So, getting back to it again. So the protesters, Mishra says, are very brave. Maybe after Gaza, and unfortunately he also says that powers usually, the big powers usually succeed. So maybe every Palestinian will be murdered. Maybe Gaza will be ethnically cleansed. Same for the West Bank and every other land in this, the sick murderous fantasy of Greater Israel, from the river to the sea. That phrase comes from the Likud party, by the way. They want to build an Israel with a Jewish majority. Actually, not anybody who's not Jewish in it. If you look at the operations, the facts on the ground, as they like to call them, and they just want to kill everybody and take it all over with Jews, European Jews preferably. Oh, so the Yemeni Jews who are in Israel, when the Europeans arrived, they started stealing their babies and giving them to European parents because they didn't want them growing up Arab. Yeah, obviously you have Arab Jews, but that wasn't good enough for them. Filthy foreigners, etc., etc. The protesters protest. What happens? The old powerful elders release military police on university students. Billionaires, Elon Musk, wreck the career options of these people. Governments imprison them. They're incredibly brave. And maybe afterwards they can move us towards, after he's predicted probable wiping out of all Palestinians and Arabs and Jordanians and Lebanese, anybody who basically has ever lived on anything that Israel wants. Maybe they can move us to a more humane future, but the book itself says not likely. Incredible book. I'm going to shut up. I'm going to read you a bit of the back here. A book of passion, fury and clarity. Mishra is one of the most important voices of our generation. That's by Peter Frankopan. A seething and erudite indictment of the West's role in the creation of Israel and everything that has flowed from it. That's from The Guardian. A humane inquiry into what suffering can make us do and the troubling question of what world we will find after Gaza. That's by Hisham Matter. We all owe Pankaj Mishra a debt for crafting eloquent, urgent, and undeniable words from the horrors of what we are struggling to witness. Afua Hirsch. With this utterly essential book, Pankaj Mishra has made a powerful contribution to the moral history of the world. Andrew O'Hagan and Rashid Halidi, who has written some good books as well. In this urgent book, Mishra grapples with the inexplicable spectacle of stone-faced Western elites, ignoring and indeed justifying the slaughter and starvation of Palestinians in Gaza. So in the 1980s, when Israel was conducting massacres in Lebanon, Reagan actually said to Israel, stop this Holocaust. He called it Holocaust. Joe Biden, who was a senator at the time, who was a senator who's taken more money from Israel than any other senator, something like $4.2 million, went there and said, oh, you shouldn't have stopped. I would have killed more. You should have killed the women and children as well. Bit of an explanation there for America's policies towards Israel, right? As he was president when this book was being written. I'll leave you with that. I suggest you read it. Fantastic book. This is what it looks like. I haven't put my camera on rear camera. This is a selfie, so I know that's backwards, but it's The World After Gaza by Pankaj Mishra. Brilliant, brave, and original. That's by William Dalrymple, and there's also something by Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein at the top, but it's kind of obscured by the buy one get one half price foil sticker. Courageous, embracing, rigorous, and something. Buy the book and you see the rest of the quote. Okay, hope you enjoyed that.